Lecture 66, Gustave Flaubert.
Do you really not know, he said, that there exist souls that are ceaselessly in torment, that are driven now to dreams, now to action, driven from the purest passions to the most orgiastic pleasures? No wonder we fling ourselves into all kinds of fantasies and follies. She stared at him as if he were a traveler from mythical lands. We poor women, she said, don't even have that escape. A poor escape, he said, since it doesn't bring happiness. But do we ever find happiness, she asked. Yes, it comes along one day, he answered. And the point has not been lost on you, the counselor was saying. Not on you, farmers and workers in the fields, not on you, champions of progress and morality. The point has not been lost on you, I say, that the storms of political strife are truly more to be dreaded than the disorders of the elements. In this passage from Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, two different kinds of speech compete for our attention. On the one hand, a flashy, philandering squire named Rodolphe pours his seductive words into the all too susceptible ears of Emma Bovary, the painfully bored wife of a plodding, mediocre health officer in the market town of Yonville-l'Abbaye in the French province of Normandy. Though Rodolphe has just met Emma, he's already steered her to the second floor of the town hall so that they can sit by themselves together at the window of the council chamber while watching the ceremonies at the agricultural show. The show is sponsored by the French government to celebrate the work of farmers and to reinforce their loyalty to the crown. So a visiting official, the prefectural councillor, has begun the speech by saluting the benevolence of the king. During the time of the novel, this is Louis Philippe, who in July of 1830 replaced the ultra-authoritarian Charles X, and who now ruled France under a constitutional monarchy. Louis Philippe aggressively promoted the interests of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and in this novel, as in Stendhal's Red and Black, the bourgeoisie want nothing to do with reviving the storms of revolution, with political upheaval, with anything that might disturb their property and goods. That is why the visiting councillor tells these farmers that political storms are their worst enemies. It is his voice that exhorts the farmers and workers at the end of the passage, his voice that urges them to go on toiling for the good of a country where order and monarchy have been restored. All right. Why does Flaubert juxtapose a private story of seduction with a public event, with all the pomp and oratory of an agricultural fair? This is one of the many questions ignored by the prosecutor at the trial of Flaubert and his publisher, who were charged with committing an outrage against religion and morality when Madame Bovary first appeared in a Parisian journal in 1856. The prosecutor at the trial, which ended by acquitting Flaubert and his publisher, read at length from the seduction scene to show that it glorified adultery. But if that was Flaubert's aim, why does he stuff this chapter with so many other things? Why does the exotic, soul-stirring speech of Rodolphe, which sounds to Emma as if it came from mythical lands, why does this exotic speech have to alternate with the stale rhetoric of politics, with the dull, drum-like thumping of phrases like progress and morality? Why does Flaubert juxtapose the lyrical words of Rodolphe and Emma with the banal bombast of the official speaker? To answer this question, consider what led Flaubert to write Madame Bovary, which first appeared in book form right after the trial in the spring of 1857, when Flaubert was 35. Born in Rouen, in the French province of Normandy, Flaubert was the second surviving son of a distinguished and wealthy doctor, the chief of surgery at the Hôtel de Dieu, the main hospital of Rouen. Like Jane Austen, Gustave Flaubert showed his talent early. By the age of 10, he was writing plays, histories of French kings, and a tribute to Pierre Corneille, the French playwright. During his school years at Rouen College Royal, where he won prizes for his academic work, he wrote several stories at age 13 and more the next year, Gothic tales of assassins, ghosts, and ravished women. At 15, he published his first story to appear in a journal for adults, a story about a bookseller who steals the first volume ever printed in Spain. On the whole, his early writing might be called escapist, or at least romantic. He admired Byron, a celebrated English romantic poet, and at 17 he wrote a passion play that shows Byron's influence. He also admired and defended Victor Hugo, a leading light of French Romanticism. And in the great romantic tradition of subjectivity and self-exploration, he produced at the ages of 16 and 20 two autobiographical narratives, Memoirs of a Madman and November. At the time he wrote November, he was living in Paris and studying law at his father's insistence. But all he really wanted to be was a writer. Fate granted his wish. In 1844, after failing his second law school exam, he was rescued, so to speak, by an attack of epilepsy. This gave him the perfect excuse to abandon the study of law and take up residence in Coissey, a village on the river Seine, just a couple of miles downstream from Rouen. It was there, in his parents' new house overlooking the river, that Flaubert would spend most of the rest of his life. But he was hardly under house arrest. By March of 1845, age 23, he was well enough to travel with his parents to Italy. In Genoa, he saw a painting that would haunt him for the rest of his life, The Temptation of St. Anthony, attributed to Peter Bruegel the Younger. Father of Christian monasticism, St. Anthony was an Egyptian hermit of the 3rd and 4th centuries who ruled a community of hermits before going off to the desert, where we are told that the devil tempted him repeatedly and in vain. Bruegel's painting of the temptation thrilled Flaubert. Against a crowded landscape of variously deformed figures shown on foot, on horseback, and in the air, St. Anthony sits pensively in the foreground. Flanked by two naked women flaunting their charms, the bearded old man turns his head, as Flaubert wrote, to avoid their caresses. And the whole scene, he adds, is swarming, crawling, mocking in a grotesque and wild manner. It is not hard to see why this painting would have captivated Flaubert. He himself was not only tempted by sensuous, beautiful women, but sometimes enraptured by them. Having lost his virginity at the age of 15, probably to his mother's chambermaid, he was seduced at the age of 18 by a tall brunette nearly twice his age, the voluptuous Eulalie, daughter of a hotel keeper in Marseille, which he visited during a tour of southern France in the summer and fall of 1840. And almost 10 years later, during a long tour of the Middle East with his friend and fellow writer Maxime Ducamp, he seems to have bedded just about every single prostitute who caught his eye. But if women could rouse his body, they never took possession of his mind. That was already spoken for by his relentless determination to make himself a writer. Though Eulalie loved him passionately, he didn't return her passion. He wrote to her simply to practice and polish his style. Even after launching a long-running affair with a beautiful Parisian poet named Louise Colette, who loved him dearly, he never lived with her and he never married her or anyone else. They met periodically for passionate trysts, but his first love was always his work. If he ever read the letters of John Keats, the English romantic poet who died just 10 months before Flaubert was born, he would have heartily agreed with what Keats wrote to Shelley. My imagination is a monastery, and I am its monk. So, here's the young Gustave Flaubert, monkishly working away in his room at Coissey, a man of romantic imagination and keen sexual appetite, who is nonetheless firmly dedicated to the religion of art. In quest of a subject, is it any wonder that he would have been irresistibly drawn to the temptation of St. Anthony? Before meeting Louise Colette in July 1846, he had already started research on this topic. And before starting to write, he devoured all sorts of recondite books, ranging from histories of the origins of Christianity to the writings of mystics such as St. Teresa of Avila. He then spent 16 months writing 500 pages. When he was finished, he called in two of his closest literary friends, Maxime Ducamp and Louis Bouillet. He brought them to Coissey so they could listen to him read the entire book aloud, on the understanding that neither of them would say a single word about it until he was done. The reading took place in September 1849 in Flaubert's bedroom and study at Croisset. It lasted 4 days, with 8 hours of reading per day. Noon to 4 in the afternoon, then 8 o'clock to midnight. On the first day, before he started to read, Flaubert waved the manuscript like a flag and said to his friends, "If you don't cry out with enthusiasm, nothing is capable of moving you." Flaubert was in for a shock. As the reading dragged on, hour after hour, day after day, nobody cried out with enthusiasm. But now and then the two friends would exchange significant glances, and privately they agreed that they would tell him exactly what they thought of it, no holes barred. So just imagine the scene as the reading finally ends. It's midnight in Flaubert's study, and he's just read aloud the very last word of a 500-page novel on which he's been working for almost 5 years. He puts down the last page, turns to his two dear friends and says, "It's your turn now. Tell me frankly what you think." And speaking for both, Bouillet says simply, "We think you should throw it in the fire and never speak of it again." Flaubert was flabbergasted. And of course, he did talk about it. The three of them argued about it heatedly all through the night, right up until 8 o'clock the next morning, with Flaubert's mother listening anxiously at the door. Flaubert defended it as best he could, pointing out fine passages here and there. But fine passages alone don't make a good book. His friends saw no progression in the story, no vitality in the figure of St. Anthony himself, no real grip on the theme. Essentially, they argued, Flaubert had taken a vague subject and made it vaguer. He had fatally indulged his own romantic tendency toward lyricism, toward the fantastic, toward the mystical. To get a grip on these tendencies, Flaubert needed something that could not be treated lyrically. Take a down-to-earth subject, they said, one of those incidents bourgeois life is full of, and force yourself to treat it in a natural manner. Notice what they're asking him to do here. Gus, stop dreaming. Stop wandering in the sterile deserts of antiquity. Repatriate your imagination. Come back to your native ground, to the here and now, to a story of bourgeois life in France in the middle of the 19th century. So finally, after 8 hours, Flaubert throws in the towel. More beaten down than persuaded, he says at last, "It won't be easy, but I'll try." It won't be easy, but I'll try. Did ever before such simple words express the birth of a writer's resolution to do something fundamentally different from what he had just written and to create something radically new in the world of fiction? Now, it's true that Flaubert did not throw into the fire his book about St. Anthony, which he later cut and polished for publication in 1874. But he was now looking ahead, not backward. On the day after the long night of the argument, the three friends took a walk through the gardens of Croisset by the river Seine. According to Maxime Ducamp, Bouillet suddenly proposed that Flaubert write a novel based on the true story of a public health officer whose second wife committed adultery, got herself into debt, and then poisoned herself. Whether or not Bouillet actually mentioned this story on the morning after the night-long argument, we know that Flaubert was thinking about it by late July of 1851, when Ducamp wrote to ask him if he was using the true story of Madame de la Mare, the adulterous wife. And we also know that on September 20, 1851, a little less than 2 months after getting Ducamp's letter, Flaubert started writing Madame Bovary. When Flaubert told his two friends that it would not be easy for him to take their advice, he spoke better than he knew. It took him 5 years to write Madame Bovary, and his letters and diaries document the ordeal of composition. Shouting himself hoarse while he wrote, he ground out barely 3 pages a week, rewriting so much that he could hardly read his own scribbles. He would sometimes spend hours hunting for a single word, and when he found it, he would still have to find a place for it. Midway through the writing of the novel, he told Louise Colette, "It is now impossible for me to write a whole sentence, good or bad. I have as much trouble placing a single word as if I were writing poetry. That statement helps to explain, at least a little, just why the writing of Madame Bovary was so hard. According to Maxime du Camp, Flaubert could not write a single line of verse, or even carry a tune. He was a writer of prose, and as such he takes his place in the great shift from poetry to prose that came to literary narrative during the 19th century. In the early years of the 19th century, Wordsworth told the story of his life in 6,000 lines of blank verse. And Byron wrote some 3,000 stanzas of a satiric epic that was left unfinished when he died. By the end of the 19th century, after Tennyson exhausted the romantic tradition of verse narrative, long stories were almost always told in prose. Yet the part that Flaubert plays in this shift from poetry to prose is wonderfully paradoxical. In spite of the beating that he took for the overheated lyricism of The Temptation, Flaubert does not simply lurch from the fantastic to the commonplace. One reason he struggled so hard with the writing of Madame Bovary is that he strove mightily to make its prose sound poetic. To Louise Colette he wrote, "To try to give prose the rhythm of verse while keeping it prose and very much prose, and to write about ordinary life the way one writes history or an epic without distorting the subject is perhaps an absurdity. But it is also perhaps a great and original experiment." In writing Madame Bovary, Flaubert struggled to fuse poetry and prose, romanticism and realism, lyricism and the stubborn facts of life in mid-19th century provincial France. "Literally speaking," he told Louise, "there are two distinct fellows inside me. One who is taken by roaring, by lyricism, and another who digs and scratches for the truth as well as he can, and who would like the reader to feel the things he describes almost palpably." So we can read Madame Bovary as the product of a collaboration between two distinct selves, a digger and a singer. Or we can see it as an extraordinarily delicate balancing act. "All the value of my book, if it has one," wrote Flaubert, "will be to have been able to walk steadily on a hair suspended between the double abyss of lyricism and vulgarity." Okay, so how does this balancing act manifest itself in the novel itself? Let us return to the passage we started with, where Rodolphe pours the language of seduction into the ears of Emma Bovary while a public official delivers a speech at the agricultural fair. The lyricism here comes from Rodolphe, who talks of souls that are ceaselessly in torment, souls driven from passions to dreams. This is the language of romantic longing. We can readily imagine it coming from the mouth of a Byronic hero. And from the earlier chapters, we know that this is just the kind of language Emma yearns to hear, that she's bored to tears by the dullness of life with a husband whose conversation was flat as a sidewalk and whose ideas inspired neither laughter nor dreams. We know, too, that Emma has been desperately waiting for something to happen. So when Rodolphe starts talking about passion and dreams, she stares at him as if he were a traveler from mythical lands, a magical figure, an enchanter, a knight in shining armor come to rescue a lady in distress. "Do we ever find happiness?" she yearningly asks. "Yes," he answers, "it comes along one day." "Here I am," he says in effect, "your dream come true." But if Emma is now falling into an abyss of lyricism, the author is not. He's already revealed that Rodolphe has a mistress in Rouen, that he plans to seduce Emma, and that he knows exactly how to exploit her yearning for excitement. So his language of passion and dreams simply reflects his own sexual agenda. Furthermore, he and Emma conduct their romantic dialogue within a framework of a commonplace event, a country fair with set speeches and stale, bloated phrasing. So even as Rodolphe tells Emma that they are each the answer to the other's dream, the visiting official is pontificating on the work of the farmer, the grinding of wheat, the fattening of flocks, and all the good things we get from chickens. And even as Rodolphe squeezes Emma's delicate hand and feels it all warm and trembling in his own, a little old shriveled woman in shabby clothes is awarded a medal for 54 years of service on a farm, years that have left her big, gnarled hands so crusted and roughened with barn dust, washing soda, and wool grease that they could never be made to look clean. As Flaubert walks the line between lyricism and vulgarity in this chapter, between the poetry of enchanted, otherworldly passion and the prose of hard, commonplace fact, we hear many different voices. Earlier in the chapter, Monsieur Homais, the self-important pharmacist, delivers a long, pedantic disquisition on the chemistry of plants to Madame Lefrançois, the buxom widow who owns the hotel right across the square from his pharmacy. In turn, she feeds him a juicy piece of gossip. The Café Français, an upstart rival to Madame's long-established hotel, will be shut down this very week because the owner can't pay his debts to Monsieur Lheureux, the dry goods dealer, and he's forcing the sale of everything in the place. So, from the voices of the pharmacist and the widow, and from many other voices in this chapter, Flaubert creates a kind of symphony, but he never loses track of his dominant theme, Rodolphe's seduction of Emma. And if you think that the other voices in this chapter have really nothing much to do with the story of Emma herself, think again. It is in the hotel of Madame Lefrançois that Emma Bovary has already met a charming young man named Léon Dupuis, who will become her lover after Rodolphe has finished with her. Monsieur Lheureux, the dry goods dealer who forces the cafe owner to close up and sell out, later leads Emma so deeply into debt that she and Charles are forced to sell everything they own. And at the end of the novel, when Emma feels her life is ruined, it is in the pharmacy of Monsieur Homais that she finds and greedily consumes a fatal dose of arsenic. Of course, we can't know all of this until we've finished the novel. But even without knowing all the implications of the chapter on the agricultural fair, we can see that Flaubert's way of organizing it is one of the most original features of his book. In cutting back and forth between the dialogue of his main characters and the speeches of the secondary figures, he anticipates the groundbreaking fiction of James Joyce, who recreates the voices of Dublin around the interior monologues of Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. He also anticipates what he would never live to see, the movies. In the jump-cut editing of directors ranging from Alfred Hitchcock to Robert Altman, the movies give us what might be called a Flaubertian sense of omniscience, juxtaposing one conversation or event with another that may be simultaneously unfolding somewhere else. Flaubert used this kind of jump cutting to recreate the whole world of his heroine and to combat his own tendencies toward romantic subjectivity. Thus, Madame Bovary exemplifies what Flaubert wrote to Louise. The author in his work must be like God in the universe, present everywhere, invisible nowhere. To be omnipresent and invisible means to see everything that might in any way influence the life of the heroine, inner and outer, body and soul. Conceived by a novelist who is bent on walking the line between lyricism and realism, Emma herself fuses spiritual aspirations with all too physical urges. When she falls deathly ill after Rodolphe casts her off, she asks for communion, and she imagines that her spirit will be annihilated in God's love, like burning incense dissolving in smoke. But when she begins to recover, she prays to God in the same ardent words she had formerly announced to her lover in the ecstasies of adultery. Soon enough, she seeks more ecstasies in the arms of a new lover, Léon Dupuis, whom she came to know in Yonville, platonically, before taking up with Rodolphe. Léon now lives in Rouen, and when Emma and Charles meet him by chance one night while attending the opera in Rouen, Léon makes a date to see Emma alone the next day at 11 in the cathedral. Younger and much less sexually experienced than Rodolphe, Léon has been so far unable to tell her of his love, much less lure her into bed. But now he feels the moment has come. As he waits impatiently for her, we read, "The church was like a gigantic boudoir suffused by her image." For Léon, as for Emma, the line between sacred and sexual dissolves in the heat of passion. Yet once again, the novel makes the heat of passion cool its heels on the platform of commonplace fact. When a guide offers to show them around the church, Emma feels obliged to say yes, because she's struggling to brace her virtue against the waves of her own desire. So even as Leon writhes with impatience, the guide rattles on about the history of the church for nearly 2 hours until Leon finally drags her off to find a cab. And just as they're getting into the cab, the guide says, "Drive past the north door, at least. Take a look at the resurrection, the last judgment, paradise, King David, and the souls of the damned in the fires of hell." "Where does monsieur wish to go?" asked the driver. "Anywhere," said Leon, pushing Emma into the carriage. Viewed from above by an author with godlike omniscience, this little scene is almost diabolically comic. Emma is torn between virtue and desire. Leon cares for nothing but seducing her. The guide cannot bear to let them go before telling them everything he knows, and the cab driver just wants to know their destination. But listen again to the symphony of voices. When the cab driver asks them where they want to go, just after the guide mentions the souls of the damned and the flames of hell, are we not tempted to wonder if that is their final destination? But this novel makes no claims about the afterlife, no claims about damnation or redemption, whether spiritual or physical. Consider what happens at the end of the novel when Charles discovers that Emma has poisoned herself. As a mere health officer of very limited skill, Charles has no idea what to do himself except to send off for 2 better men, 2 doctors from nearby towns. One of these doctors, Canivet, has already been called in to resolve an earlier crisis. When Charles botched an operation on a boy with a club foot, and the boy then developed gangrene, Canivet amputated the leg and scolded Charles for his incompetence. Now Canivet comes again, and this time prescribes an emetic so that Emma can empty her stomach of poison. But to the bafflement of Canivet, the emetic only makes her worse. At this critical point, 3 galloping horses drawing a post-chaise bring to the Bovary house what looks at first like salvation. Dr. La Rivière. The sudden appearance of a god, we read, wouldn't have caused greater excitement. Based in part on Flaubert's own father, La Rivière is truly a godlike doctor. But he is not omnipotent, just omniscient. His scalpel-sharp glance, we read, cut deep into your soul, exposing any lies buried under excuses and reticences. The doctor thus seems a model for the novelist himself, for his own determination to reveal everything, to veil nothing in illusion or sentimentality. So the doctor offers no miracle cure, no magical rescue, no divine intervention. After first severely scolding Canivet for prescribing an emetic, he tells Charles simply, "Come, my poor boy, be brave. There's nothing to be done." Thus the great La Rivière combines sympathy for Charles with an unflinching recognition of the facts, a refusal to hide the truth, no matter how bitter it may be. Like the wise doctor, the novel itself presents the death of Emma with a combination of lyrical poignancy, clinical precision, and godlike circumspection, the capacity to see all of Emma's world to the very end. As Emma lies on her deathbed, we read, her tongue hung at full length from her mouth. Her rolling eyes grew dim like the globes of 2 lamps about to go out, and one might have thought her dead already but for the terrifying, ever faster movement of her ribs, which were shaken by furious gasps as though her soul were straining violently to break its fetters. Yet even now, with Emma on the point of death, the ordinary voices of the living world must have their say. From the sidewalk outside the house comes the raucous cry of a blind beggar whom Emma has seen and heard earlier. He's singing a bawdy song about lasses straying in dreams of love on warm days, lying down in the furrows by stalks of wheat left by the swinging scythe. Through the stalks of wheat left by the scythe and the notes of the bawdy song, we can visualize the specter of the grim reaper. When Emma hears the beggar's song, she sits up like a galvanized corpse, her hair streaming, her eyes fixed and gaping. She cries out, "The blind man!" and begins to laugh, a horrible, frantic, desperate laugh, fancying that she saw the beggar's face, a figure of terror looming in the darkness of eternity. This last fantastic image might have come straight from the phantasmagoric world of Flaubert's desert dream, The Temptation of St. Anthony. but it springs instead from Emma's response to the coarse, commonplace, ordinary life around her, to one more of the amazing variety of voices that make up her world. If Madame Bovary was a great and original experiment, infusing a lyrical, romantic imagination with the commonplace facts of ordinary life, then I think we may say the experiment resoundingly succeeds to the very end of the book.